My name is Anna Péceli. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Welcome to today's lecture on breaking the double bind, U.S. defense strategy and multi-theater deterrence. Our guest today is Dr. Evan Montgomery. Before I introduce our speaker, a quick reminder of the rules of engagement. Our speaker will talk for about 30 to 45 minutes. This part of the lecture will be recorded and later uploaded on the CGSR website. The second part of the lecture is the Q&A session that is off the record to encourage a more frank conversation with our guest today. You can ask your question either by raising your hand and then Katie Thomas will help me unmute you, or you can type your question in the chat function and I will read it to our speaker. Please make sure that you send your questions to all panelists, not just the speakers, so that I can actually see them and read it out loud to Evan. And with that, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Evan Montgomery today. He is Vice President for Research and Studies at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Over nearly 2 decades at CSBA, Dr. Montgomery has written dozens of monographs, reports, articles, and chapters on a wide range of defense policy issues. In 2016 and 17, he served as Special Advisor to the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where he focused on defense innovation and nuclear modernization. He also teaches a graduate course on military effectiveness in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. Dr. Montgomery graduated summa cum laude from Villanova University and received his MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. He is a past recipient of the Smith Richardson Foundation Strategy and Policy Fellowship, the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and the Department of Defense Joint Civilian Service Commendation Award. Evan, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Anna. Thank you for having me and for the introduction. Hello to all the folks that I can't see, but thank you for joining. I'm going to try to share my slides. Success. Okay. So the remarks I'm going to offer today are based on a report that was released about a month and a half ago. It's called Breaking the Double Bind, U.S. Defense Strategy and Multi-Theater Deterrence. And as Anna said, I'll talk about 30 minutes and go through this before we get to Q&A. So I guess I'll just offer kind of the bottom line up front, what this report is all about. The fundamental question it tries to wrestle with is how the United States reconciles, on the one hand, having a one major war military, at least sort of ostensibly since the 2018 NDS, kind of embracing the idea that the United States as a military that is really designed and postured for one major war, with the reality of a multi-rival, multi-theater world. The fact the United States still has commitments across multiple regions, that it still has ongoing adversarial relationships with a variety of rivals. And how to reconcile this tension, especially at a time when U.S. rivals are actually cooperating much more closely with one another, which is, I think, one of the kind of key features of the current security environment and something we're seeing going on in the context of the war against Iran right now. The report basically makes 3 key arguments. The first is that the U.S. cannot easily deprioritize its secondary rivals. It can't necessarily narrow its geographic focus specifically on Northeast and Southeast Asia. And it can't easily concentrate on military competition inside the first island chain in that region, despite the fact that that has been a key objective for the United States over the last several years and has been a feature of both the recent national security strategy and national defense strategy. In my view, this kind of China centrism is actually a recipe for an increased threat of opportunism on the part of other rivals. And for reasons that I'll explain later that really have to do with the interconnections and interrelationships between rivals and rivalries, an increased threat of opportunism in other regions could actually magnify the pacing threat that is China and could actually make it worse for the United States. So the bottom line is the United States needs to find some way to effectively manage a host of rivalries. It has limited its ability to concentrate on just one. The second argument in the paper, in the report, is that there is an implicit theory, I think, on Washington's part for how you do this, how you manage all these rivals. And that hinges on the ability to successfully fight in a quick, early, rapid, decisive battle against the pacing threat that is against China. If the United States can put itself in a position to defeat China quickly and defeat China conclusively, and do so in advance of fighting other rivals, that is one theory for how you manage a variety of threats. I would argue that that theory is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain, that the United States is perhaps on the verge of kind of getting China wrong, at least when you think about defense strategy and defense policy. And because it does prioritize China, at least on paper, if it gets China wrong, it will get its other threats wrong too. The last argument in the paper is that dealing on the one hand with the threat from China and on the other hand with other rivals, be it Iran, the DPRK, or others, will require a shift in defense strategy. And that entails backing off from what I would kind of call maximal denial, which I think has been the focus of U.S. defense planning and strategy for the last half dozen years or so. And moving away from the theory of multi-theater deterrence through decisive battle against the pacing threat. The alternative that I talk about in the report, I call minimum essential denial and protracted punishment, but essentially entails placing less emphasis on the ability to quickly execute a defense of Taiwan and defeat a fait accompli attempt by China, and placing more emphasis on a protracted war against China that entails punishment as much as it does denial. So the background for this report is a series of articles that I've worked on either kind of on my own or with a number of co-authors over the past handful of years. And so this report really does try to pull together a few different threads that I've been wrestling with. And that includes work on the risks of abandoning the two-war construct that used to drive or be at the center of U.S. defense planning and embracing this kind of one major war force planning construct in its stead. Some of the problems associated with kind of extreme maximal versions of a denial strategy, in particular denial via something very nearly akin to annihilation when thinking about how the U.S. would fight the PLA. Work on how the United States can manage both its pacing threat, but also these so-called lesser included cases that it needs to deal with, opportunistic aggression and what it's looked like in the past and the future, and also issues like a protracted Sino-US war and how threats from China against Taiwan are evolving and may not necessarily manifest as kind of the large-scale Chinese invasion that has been the focus of U.S. defense planning efforts for quite some time. This one other, I guess, point of context. This report is about multi-theater deterrence. It's obviously about how to reconcile the China threat with threats from other actors. It was, I think, officially released at the very end of February. I think we put it up on the web on a Friday, and then Saturday morning I woke up, I looked at my phone, and Operation Epic Fury was underway. I have yet to decide if that makes the arguments in the paper increasingly relevant or completely overtaken by events. I will leave that to you and the audience to judge. I will not, I think in the presentation, talk about Iran and Epic Fury directly in any great detail, but I'm happy to kind of discuss what the implications of the findings in this report and the arguments are for what is currently going on in the Middle East as we get to the Q&A. So by way of background, I'll say a little bit about kind of the strategy debate, or at least the strategy debate, as it was a month ago or so, and as it's evolved over the past several years. And I'm going to oversimplify here, but really a lot of the debate on U.S. defense strategy, I think, comes down to the debate between what you might call prioritizers and what you might also call primicists. The prioritizers, who don't necessarily agree on everything, it's not a firmly defined camp, but in general, it's a view that emphasizes the risk of global overextension. This is a view that highlights the emergence of a so-called Lippmann gap, a situation in which U.S. commitments exceed its available resources, and that highlights the danger that the United States will not have sufficient capability to compete with its main long-term threat, which in the view of, I think, most in the defense policy community is and remains China. Because of that growing concern about overextension, prioritizers tend to be much more willing than primicists or others to embrace, some degree of selective retrenchment, to really highlight the need for very significant burden sharing with U.S. allies and partners to enable Washington to concentrate more and more of its capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region and against the PRC. So it may not reflect necessarily a radical shift in grand strategy, but a pretty significant effort to reapportion resources to focus more on China, given the scale and scope and the consequences of that particular threat. And in practical terms, a lot of this over the years, the prioritization argument has really kind of turned on this idea that the United States should move away from a two-war or multi-war force planning construct that kind of spreads its resources very thin, and focus instead on this one major war force planning construct to really design and posture the force as much as possible with China first and foremost in mind. On the other side of the spectrum, if you will, you have kind of the classic primicists, if you will. It may not be the best term, but I think it kind of encapsulates, the traditional kind of status quo approach to U.S. grand strategy and defense policy, and that has a few notable features. The first is not that primicists are unconcerned about overextension, but tend to be more concerned about the possibility of opportunistic aggression. Right, the possibility that one U.S. rival could be incentivized to exploit any conflict that the United States is fighting against another rival, and may see that opening as a chance to engage in coercion, to attack its neighbors, to expand in some capacity. Because of that concern about opportunistic aggression, and because of, I think, some maybe healthy skepticism about the ability of allies and partners to take on more and more responsibility, there is a reticence on the part of primicists to downgrade rivalries with weaker opponents. So a clear unwillingness to kind of sideline rivalries with Russia, DPRK, Iran, whomever. And also a reticence to count on frontline allies and partners to contain those other rivals more or less on their own, which is, I think, the kind of at least the aspiration of some prioritizers, that we can turn a lot more responsibility for managing the Russia threat over to the Europeans, a lot more responsibility, at least as of, again, a month ago or so, for managing the Iran threat over to Middle Eastern countries, be it Israel, the GCC states, or a combination of the two, and certainly a lot more responsibility over to South Korea to manage the threat from the North Korean regime. And again, the primicists differ from the prioritizers in that they continue to generally advocate for a multi-war force planning construct of some kind. They've been very skeptical about the one war force planning construct that, again, first was kind of cemented in the 2018 NDS, National Defense Strategy, but has carried forward since then. And you can see the influence of this kind of primicist argument, I think, especially in the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, the independent commission chartered by Congress to review the NDS, and the last, I think, two iterations of that panel essentially have encapsulated the primicist debate and have been very skeptical of the prioritization alternative. So the challenge, I think there are a lot of challenges with prioritization in particular. I think it would be fair to say that there's widespread agreement that the military and economic threat from China outweighs the threat from other U.S. rivals, at least certainly over the long term, if not the near term, and that it does require increased concentration and level of effort on the part of the United States. But prioritization does come with significant risks. And the first one that I just want to talk about briefly is unilateral opportunism. So I mentioned that primicists in particular tend to be very concerned about opportunistic aggression, the possibility of one U.S. rival taking advantage of U.S. being distracted and perhaps in a conflict or competition with another rival to try to engage in some form of aggression on its own. And that can certainly happen unilaterally. And that's something that prioritization, I would argue, increases the risk of. That to the extent the United States does explicitly claim to be and try to focus more on China, secondary, if you will, secondary US rivals have increased freedom of action, right? They have a little bit more latitude to engage in aggression if Washington is essentially signaling that they are not the priority, that it's going to focus its attention on China, and that it's concerned about unnecessarily burning resources on efforts to contain those secondary rivals. So more freedom of action equals greater threat of opportunism. And I think there's an interesting historical analog to this concern that I write about in the report a little bit, which many people may be familiar with, but it's the late Imperial German risk theory that underpinned the development of a much larger Imperial German Navy. And at the time, the late 19th, early 20th century, you had a Germany that was a continental land power in Europe that aspired to have a large battle fleet and that looked to challenge British naval supremacy at the time, even though Britain, by all standard measures, was kind of far and away a much more powerful naval actor. But the logic that underpinned this buildup was the idea that Britain was in competition with multiple rivals. It wasn't just worried about Germany, it was worried about Russia, it was worried about France, especially in the maritime domain. And that created an argument, or led to an argument on the German side, that Germany didn't need to build a navy that matched the British ship for ship. It didn't need to establish parity. It just needed to be strong enough that it can inflict enough damage on the Royal Navy that Britain would be left far more vulnerable to its more larger and kind of more proximate naval rivals, in particular Russia and France. And if Germany could kind of achieve that level of capability, Britain would be reluctant to challenge it, and it would give Germany kind of a free hand to engage in revisionist behavior on the continent. That didn't work for Germany at the time. The British responded with a variety of military and especially diplomatic efforts that essentially undercut the rationale behind the risk theory, in particular using diplomacy to kind of sideline or downgrade British rivalries with Russia and France and reduce this multi-theater, multi-rival threat. But I think is interesting and worrisome is that you could see how a similar logic would prevail among secondary US adversaries today and encourage them to engage in aggression at a time when the United States is ostensibly focused on another threat, namely China, which is we don't need to do enough damage. We don't need to beat the United States. We don't need to defeat them on the battlefield. We just need to inflict enough damage or force them to consume so many resources that they would be in a much worse position vis-a-vis China. And that, in theory, should deter the United States or limit its ability to stop any form of opportunistic aggression. And so that's, I think, the rationale, the logic behind the concern that prioritization can raise the risk of unilateral opportunism by a secondary threat. The other issue I want to flag, and that sort of lends the title of the report, is this idea of collaborative opportunism. And the idea here is that US rivals have increased incentives to coordinate with one another across theaters and to support one another across theaters, especially at a time when the United States is trying to juggle multiple rivalries and is ostensibly focusing on one of them. China could support other US rivals to essentially prevent the United States from concentrating its resources in the Indo-Pacific and East Asia. Right, it is an incentive to see stronger, more capable Iran's, Russia's, DPRKs, because it makes it that much harder for the United States to pull back from managing those rivalries. And it raises the bar that allies and partners would have to meet to contain those rivals more or less on their own. And obviously, we've seen a high level of collaboration between those rivals in the case of the war between Russia and Ukraine. And there have been a number of reports, as I'm sure many have seen, about both Russian and Chinese support to Iran over the last month to make things more difficult for the United States. At the same time, you can imagine scenarios where other US rivals actually have incentives to support China to effectively encourage the United States to concentrate its resources on the China problem. That support might be more limited going in that direction simply because China is so much more capable than other US rivals. But the Irans, DPRKs, and Russias and others in the world do have the ability to distract the United States in a variety of ways as it's trying to focus its attention on China, and that can have real implications for the military balance in the Indo-Pacific, especially during a potential ongoing conflict or a protracted war. You can imagine ways in which other US rivals would look to actually provide material support to China to, again, force the United States to concentrate its resources and its attention on the PRC problem, and then thereby giving those secondary rivals a free hand. But the bottom line is this does create kind of a structural double bind, if you will, right? China wants the United States to focus on everyone else. Everyone else wants the United States to focus on China. They collaborate with one another and kind of put the United States betwixt and between, which creates a significant dilemma. It also means that the rivalries that the United States is engaged in and trying to manage are interconnected, and that we still have a tendency, it seems, to treat them as kind of separate entities and as stovepiped competitions. But they're interrelated. Those rivals do and could support one another in a variety of ways. And it also means a failure to contain secondary threats and manage them effectively could actually make the pacing threat worse. So simply, downgrading and ignoring secondary threats in the hope that it will allow the United States to focus more intently on the China problem may be a miscalculation. Ignoring or downgrading those threats may provide more opportunities for those states to engage in regional aggression that distracts the United States, or to even funnel more resources and support in a variety of ways to China, making it a harder problem for the United States to manage. The one other point I'll just note on the slide before moving on is this is a dynamic, certainly the collaborative opportunism in particular is a dynamic that it was recognized in the 2026 National Defense Strategy. All right, the authors of that document actually specifically call out the possibility of collaboration between US rivals working with one another across theaters. They just point to a sort of a different and particular theory for how one manages that problem, which I'll talk about in just a second. So as you think about the incentive to try to prioritize one rival over others, as you think about the challenges of doing so in terms of both individual opportunism on the part of secondary rivals and even collaborative opportunism on the part of those rivals, it creates a pretty big puzzle and a pretty big challenge for the United States. Because what policymakers essentially need to do, or try to do, is firstly improve the position of the United States relative to China, its biggest challenger, without over-concentrating its resources and essentially opening the door to opportunistic aggression by other rivals. At the same time, it needs to figure out a way to deal with those other rivals without so diluting its resources that it doesn't have a sufficient capability to deter China from engaging in large acts of aggression in its region, or stopping it if it does. And it has to solve both those problems at a time when adversaries are cooperating with one another more closely and managing all the problems that are associated with that. So that is a pretty tall order. There are a handful of ways one might deal with this, which could be pursued individually, or they could be pursued in concert with one another. But they're problematic. Kind of the first and most obvious is simply to increase defense spending. At the end of the day, if a lot of the problems that the United States faces stem from a limited capacity to manage so many different challengers, you can try to increase that capacity. You can try to close the so-called Lippmann gap by having more resources to bring the resource levels into alignment with your existing commitments. And certainly we're seeing that, and we're in a period of a multi-year defense budget increase. And obviously there are reports that the Department of Defense has released its proposed budget and is looking at kind of a $1.5 trillion budget potentially, in addition to the resources for the war against Iran. So there is certainly an effort to increase defense resources. I think there's questions about the extent to which that will materialize, and if it does, will it materialize in ways that actually enable the United States to manage its competitions all at once? And we could talk again more about that in the Q&A, but a lot of I think questions about where those resources go, how much can we build, in what period of time, and how effectively are they dispersed. Another option, if shortfalls or limitations in conventional military capabilities are kind of at the heart of the problem, is that the United States could rely more on its unconventional capabilities. It could rely more on nuclear weapons in particular, not just to get so more bang for the buck, but to actually rely on nuclear threats and nuclear deterrence and nuclear coercion with respect to some adversaries, so it can perhaps free up conventional resources that could be devoted to managing other adversaries. There are a number of challenges with that. Obviously, there are questions about the adequacy of the US nuclear arsenal in light of not just Russia's modernized nuclear arsenal and North Korea's growing nuclear arsenal, but of course, China's kind of rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal. But there's also a question about whether the United States has or is likely to develop the types of nuclear weapons with in particular, the types of weapons with the types of yields that would be a credible deterrent to non-nuclear aggression, or whether its strategic weapons would be essentially ill fit for purpose if you tried to expand that purpose and use them as a more central component of deterrence. A third option is trying to use diplomacy, right, to sideline some rivals so you can concentrate more of your attention and resources militarily on others. As I mentioned in passing a moment ago, this is one of the things that the British did very successfully when they kind of faced this rising threat from Germany and were trying to juggle multiple rivalries in the late 19th and early 20th century, which is reach diplomatic agreements with France and Russia that at least partially sideline those rivalries and enabled Britain to concentrate more on Germany and undercut the German rationale and the risk theory that underpinned its naval buildup at the time. That is certainly a possibility. I think the challenge there that is worth flagging is that one of the conditions that is most conducive to that level of diplomacy and to trying to essentially diplomatically resolve ongoing rivalries is a common threat. And what we see is that the common threat for U.S. rivals is actually the United States, not one another. And so the structural conditions there do not seem particularly positive when it comes to looking for a diplomatic solution to the multi-rival, multi-theater problem. The last two options I highlight because I think they're some of the most relevant in terms of what the current administration is doing. First is burden shifting, right? And this is really the central approach, I think, that has been advocated by the administration publicly, and it's highlighted in the 2026 National Defense Strategy in particular, but the idea is allies, partners are the solution to this problem, right? The United States needs to shift its burdens, or at least a large portion of them, to allies and partners. They need to carry more water, and if they do, the United States can, on the one hand, focus more of its attention on China. On the other hand, worry less about threats from other rivals because allies and partners will have that problem or those problem sets. This has, again, been a kind of a common touch point going back well before this current administration or the first Trump administration. Everyone always wants allies and partners to carry more water and to do more. And certainly we're seeing some positive developments on that front in terms of increased defense spending and efforts to take on more responsibility, or in the case of Japan, take on new responsibilities that they had previously avoided for various domestic and constitutional reasons. But having said that, I think there are limits to just how much allies and partners can do and just how fast they can do it. And clearly the aspiration on the part of the administration is to move very quickly and shift burdens in a pretty swift period of time. And I'm just not sure that's feasible. The last kind of alternative theory about managing this multi-theater, multi-rival challenge that I want to mention, because it does seem kind of relevant to current events, and I'll just mention it briefly now, we can talk more about it later, is there is a sequencing argument that you can try to defeat your weaker adversaries to set conditions to be able to focus more on stronger ones. And that's not to say that is the rationale behind Operation Epic Fury, but if you were looking for a kind of geopolitical logic for a large-scale conflict with a secondary rival at a time when the United States is trying to focus on a pacing threat, the idea of perhaps kind of taking a weaker opponent off the board and creating conditions where you can concentrate more resources on a stronger opponent does seem to be the argument one might make. And I think you've heard a little bit of that here and there from administration officials and press reporting. But nevertheless, that's another one that one might offer, a theory, an approach that one might offer to dealing with this very thorny problem that I outline above. How are we doing this instead, or how have we traditionally done it in recent years? How have we looked to solve this multi-theater, multi-rival problem? I think a lot of this really rests on the idea of decisive battle against China, and so therefore I think it rests on an approach, a theory that is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. If you were kind of setting out the equation for how you try to manage multiple rivals, multiple threats, you might outline it in 5 steps. And I can't hear anyone, so I don't know if I'll get a laugh at step 4, but I find it amusing. Step 1 is you rack and stack your rivals. And we've clearly done that, at least again on paper, and said that China is the pacing threat, it's the pacing challenger, whatever term you want to use. But again, little doubt that certainly over the long term, the military and economic and diplomatic challenges posed by China dwarf those posed by Russia, the DPRK, Ukraine, Venezuela, not Ukraine, Russia, DPRK, Iran, Venezuela, or others. And again, relatively little debate about that, but that's step 1, who is the pacing threat? Step 2 is how do you, reconcile the pacing threat with secondary threats? Do you treat them as unique, bespoke cases that require very different types of forces than those needed for the pacing threat? Or do you treat them as kind of lesser included cases, as threats that can be managed with roughly broadly the same set of tools that one would use to manage the pacing threat? And I think the trend is that we adopt the latter approach. We treat most of our other rivals, other than China, as lesser included cases, and we bank on the assumption that if you can build a force that has the capability and the capacity to handle the threat from China, then you have a force that has the capability and the capacity to handle other secondary rivals, whoever they are, with some obvious exceptions that some capabilities are, like ground forces, more useful against, say, a DPRK potentially than they would be against a China. But again, step 1, you establish the pacing threat. Step 2, you determine that other threats are lesser included cases. Step 3, you come up with your point solution for dealing with the pacing threat that is hopefully fungible and applicable to those secondary rivals, those lesser included cases. And in this case, we essentially have one, and it's denial of a cross-strait invasion, right? We worry about the pacing scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and we've essentially adopted, the mindset that we need to kind of very quickly deny the PLA the ability to establish, lodgements on Taiwan in pursuit of conquest of the island. And so we focus most of our attention on trying to figure out how to inflict as much damage on the PLA in above and below the Taiwan Strait as possible. Step 4, question mark. Step 5, somehow this leads to multi-theater deterrence. And the step 4, this is kind of hard, I suppose, to do with a non-interactive audience, but I remember when I first arrived at the Pentagon, a acquaintance and friend, a co-author now, relayed to me the story of the underpants nose from South Park that had underdeveloped ideas for how to achieve some particular solution to a problem. And this amusing skit was kind of relayed to me as a really easy way to understand how bad ideas essentially proliferate in bureaucracies. And to me, there's a natural lash up here between how we think about managing the China problem and other problems with this idea, because there's a step missing. Right? There's a theory that if we develop the capabilities to deal with China, and then we also have the capabilities to deal with lesser included cases, and if we can develop, the tools necessary to manage our pacing scenario, we will somehow produce deterrence across multiple theaters. But there is a little step missing in the process. And to my mind, the step that's missing that doesn't often get, I think, vocalized, but I think is implied in a lot of discussions, is what I would call maximum denial and decisive battle, the ability to defeat the pacing threat quickly and conclusively, which are the necessary conditions to keep other opportunists at bay. Or if it does not allow us to keep other opportunists at bay, leaves us with sufficient capability to take them on sequentially if necessary. And you can see this reflected in some of the quotes on the slide, which include something that folks have probably heard because it's been mentioned a number of times over the years, the aspiration that the United States should try to have the ability to essentially eliminate the bulk of Chinese naval and maritime forces in just a handful of days, that's kind of the key to deterring aggression against the strait. Also a commentary from someone who I respect a lot, who was involved in writing about the 2018 NDS and the shift to the one warforce planning construct, and kind of offering this rationale of, hey, if we have a force that can really take on effectively the pacing threat, then everyone else should essentially be overawed and stay in their corners. And that's the way you deal with opportunism. That is the step that I think is missing from how we prioritize China on paper and how we plan for it in practice, and then how we expect that this will translate to deterrence against other rivals in other theaters. The problem, in my view, is that this missing step is of maximal denial, of decisive battle. It really rests on three big assumptions that are very problematic. The first assumption is that you fight China first. That if other to think about this, if other conflicts come first, if you are fighting secondary rivals in advance of going up against your pacing threat, then you're not going up against your pacing threat with one major war force, you're going up against your pacing threat against a less than one major war force because of any resources that have been expended, because of any losses that have been sustained. And again, this has obviously been one of the chief criticisms of the current conflict against Iran, the idea that the United States is expending resources, losing assets, taking not significant but still noticeable losses in ways that will decrement its overall capability to deter or, if necessary, fight China. And so, the fight China first argument, that you need to be in a position to go up against your pacing threat with essentially the full kit available at your disposal, is highly problematic. And I think current events prove that that's highly problematic. Those secondary threats often do materialize in advance of the pacing threat. The second assumption about kind of decisive battle, the second kind of key to making that work, and therefore having a credible holistic theory of multi-theater deterrence, is that you have to fight China fast, right? Protraction, unfortunately, is the rule, not the exception, when it comes to major power conflicts. And that means if the United States were to fight China, and if the conflict were to go on, not just for weeks, but for months or even longer, it simply provides more chances, more windows of opportunity for other adversaries to engage in aggression, or to look for opportunities to actually assist China and make it a tougher nut for the United States to crack. And again, we are already going into, I think, the second month of Operation Epic Fury against a much weaker adversary. I think it's an unrealistic expectation to think that a conflict with the PRC would be a quick affair. So if you have to fight China first and you have to fight China fast, I think those are very problematic assumptions. The last implicit assumption, which is right there in the name, decisive battle, is you have to win big. It's necessary to have a successful, highly successful campaign against the PRC, because if you expend considerable assets, if you take heavy losses, you're simply not going to have necessarily the capability, the capacity left over to deter, if necessary, to respond to other threats in other regions. But again, I think the realistic expectation is that a Sino-US conflict would be extremely costly. Losses have the potential to be very heavy. And as a result, the losses sustained in an opening campaign in that conflict could undermine the ability of the United States to either A, fight a longer war against the PRC if conflict is protracted, but also B, keep a lid on instability and opportunistic aggression by other rivals in other regions. And so, the bottom line here is that I think we have a largely implicit, somewhat underdeveloped, and I think increasingly problematic theory about how we reconcile all of our defense commitments, and how we maintain deterrence vis-a-vis multiple rivals across multiple regions. And I will move on from the underpants notes. So what's the solution? If that's a D problem or a laundry list of problems, how do we think about going ahead and addressing those problems? So what I talk about in the report is something that I refer to as minimum essential denial and protracted punishment. And minimum essential denial isn't to say that the United States should abandon its kind of existing commitment to denial, but maybe it should back away from its aspiration to inflict kind of maximal denial against the PLA. The objective, I think, should be to disrupt an invasion of Taiwan as much as possible at the lowest cost possible. And I mean the lowest cost possible in terms of force structure and munitions needed to either A, fight a long war against the PRC, if protraction is, again, the rule, not the exception, and to B, keep opportunists in check. I think there are a lot of reasons to maintain a denial posture to support Taiwan and to deter the PLA. That includes maintaining at least some barriers to invasion. There should be no free pass for China. That includes the possibility that, although I would suspect, and I think many would, that conflict with China may be very costly. We actually don't know that. We may be overestimating PRC and PLA strength. The need to maintain alliances. I do believe that keeping some quote unquote skin in the game is necessary for alliance management in the region. And also a denial posture in the region that makes invasion costly is a source of cost imposition on the Chinese. It forces them to kind of increase the level of effort they have to put towards an invasion, and then presumably maybe decreases some of the effort and resources that they are able to devote to competing with the United States globally. So denial is not inherently a bad thing. Denial is important, denial is necessary, but the commitment to denial, I think, can go too far and put the United States in a position where it is ill-prepared for a protracted fight, ill-prepared to continue to deter opportunism. So some of the key considerations, I think, for minimum essential denial at like a very macro level include placing more emphasis on force preservation over responsiveness. And so really ensuring that the United States isn't unnecessarily putting critical and difficult to replace assets at risk in service of a quick and massive and forceful intervention in support of Taiwan. Reducing the objectives for the amount of damage that needs to be inflicted against the PLA. And I think the important subtext here is in a war with China, you can think about Taiwan and its status as the end state, or you can think about it as one piece of a much larger conflict. My bias is to think about it as one piece of a much larger conflict, and that might mean actually going to devoting less effort to actually the immediate defense of Taiwan in service of preserving forces that can be used against China in other ways. And lastly, to maximize the utility of the denial capabilities that you do have or do use, embracing a greater willingness to do two things. One, strike deep into China against mainland targets and not simply confine military operations to the area in, above, and below the Taiwan Strait, and even potentially a greater willingness to kind of fight close in, that is to say, targeting Chinese forces that might happen to actually establish a lodgment on Taiwan, rather than going to great effort to actually prevent that from ever happening. The other half of this equation is the protracted punishment. And this is, I think, a much more significant shift than simply kind of downgrading or placing a little bit less emphasis on denial, but actually looking to find ways to degrade China's geoeconomic position and to degrade its war-related industry to hopefully be in a position to achieve war termination on favorable conditions, while still having the military capability and the capacity to credibly threaten to project force against other rivals. I think the bottom line here is that denial at any level, even a maximal effort at denial, is not likely to be enough. If you're talking about a great power war against your number one rival and a near peer or peer in many ways, denial doesn't necessarily have a clear theory of victory. Denial is unlikely to be sufficient in the context of a protracted war. denial is likely to put you in a position where losses early on are quite large. And that also all, I think, makes establishes the case to actually really embrace and think through the alternative to denial, which is punishment, right? How can the United States bring other costs to bear against China over the course of a long war? How can it expand the scope of its military operations to simply go beyond frontline military forces that are the spearhead of an invasion? And to do so, to pose dilemmas on China, to impose costs on China, both in peacetime and wartime, and to exploit some of the inherent advantages that the United States has over China, which is to say not simply fighting a great power in its backyard, but looking for ways to project power horizontally, because that great power is now increasingly global and has vulnerabilities, and to escalate vertically, because the United States still has a power projection advantage over the PRC and a greater ability to hold conventionally targets at risk on mainland China than China does vis-a-vis the United States. Here are some key considerations for protracted punishment. As I mentioned before, this requires, I think, rethinking the stakes of a conflict and thinking about war with China as bigger than conflict over Taiwan. That may be the starting point of a conflict. It is unlikely to be the end point of a conflict. It requires, I think, thinking more expansively about the types of tools that the United States brings to bear, which again, not simply conventional precision strikes against frontline forces, but various forms of economic interdiction, other forms of horizontal escalation against China's global interests, and vertical escalation conventionally as well. And it also requires thinking about some of the risks. The obvious one is would there be domestic political and public support for this kind of expansive conflict, but also it means being alive to the possibility that what we do to others, we should be prepared for others to try to do to us, and therefore that threats against U.S. interests overseas or against U.S. targets on the homeland would be something that the United States should prepare for in this type of contingency. Last slide, and I'll wrap up here, is that I want to talk briefly about the force structure implications of punishment versus denial. Here, this report that I'm talking about actually draws on an earlier one that I wrote with a few colleagues of mine about a year ago. And, we ran an exercise. We ran a lot of strategic choices exercise here at CSBA. Using our online rebalancing tool to look at different force structure options and trade-offs, usually over a 10-year time horizon. And we ran an exercise in which we gave participants different budget levels, but we also gave them two different scenarios to consider. One was kind of a maximal defense of Taiwan, so a true kind of full-throated denial defense of Taiwan. The other was a much more modest effort to defend Taiwan, complemented with various efforts to inflict punishment over months or longer against China. And what we found, I think that was very interesting and instructive and is kind of captured here in the slide, is a lot of the specific force structure investments were insensitive to the different strategic guidance that participants and teams received. That regardless of whether the United States were going to adopt a maximal approach to the defense of Taiwan and really truly embrace denial, or think about complementing it with a much more significant punishment campaign, you are going to need a robust defense industrial base to stockpile munitions, either for the short and intense fight or to preserve magazine depth over a long conflict. You are going to need more platforms with longer ranges, greater survivability, whether again to kind of fight in the WES in the early conflict, or because you're looking to conduct a global cost imposing campaign. And again, irrespective of strategy, there was a strong argument for more unmanned systems, either as complements or substitutes for air and maritime assets in particular, perform a variety of different roles. And that's not to say there aren't significant force size and force structure differences in terms of that are associated with different strategies. But I think it does mean that there is a strong rationale for a common set of defense investments and common force structure changes, irrespective of the strategy that you adopt. And so there are a lot of political and strategic considerations that are I think, kind of first and foremost, and I don't want to say more important than the force structure, but certainly precede discussions about force structure. So that I will stop there. and happy to take questions about any of the content here. Also happy to take questions about how this work relates to what's been happening in the world over the past month. Thank you.